Medan ni tar plats så kan jag säga att för de av er som undrar vad kan jag nu läsa om det här? Hur kan jag nu bli påmind om vad som hände? Så kommer presentationer, filmer och annat material från konferensen att finnas på webben alldeles snart efter konferensen. Till exempel imorgon. Eller så. Nu fick de panik. Mycket snart. Hörni, välkomna ni som har tillkommit. Jag vet att nu är det en open session och en del av er kanske inte var här tidigare i eftermiddag. Så jag heter Lars Mogensen, är journalist och föreställer moderator här idag. Och det här är David Simon, and I will now switch into English. I know you understand what we say, but you prefer English. David Simon, professor and director of Mistra Urban Futures. Recently, he edited this book, Rethinking Sustainable Cities, which there is a short, brief Swedish summary and version, a translation, which you all can find down in the corner if you didn't already do it. Ett nytt sätt att tänka på hållbara städer, tillgängliga, gröna och rättvisa. So sustainable cities, fair, green and accessible. And David Simon has chosen to do something very, very rare today. He will be talking without any slides. So please go ahead.
My apologies. You will have to listen to me and not be distracted by the visual image.
Just a second. Where's the here? Okay.
Okay. Right. Can you hear? Yeah, that's better. Even I can hear myself now. We've spent a lot of time in fascinating sessions today thinking about these three words, fair, green, and accessible. And we started with Margareta in the morning discussing the relationship among those three concepts, and then we had the second half of the morning and the parallel sessions now examining these concepts individually. So rather like Humpty Dumpty, I'm going to try and put the egg back together again and see where that gets us, both in terms of our understanding of the interrelationships between fairness, greenness, and accessibility, but also in terms of thinking our way forward, which helps us also in transition to the final session, which Margareta is going to lead us, where we're starting to think through, as indeed we have been doing for a while already within the center itself, about what kind of center it is that we want to have from 2020, once the current phase of funding from the combination of Mistra and SIDA and the consortium here in Göteborg comes to an end. So all of these things are interrelated, and the one, to some extent, is also a metaphor for the other, even if it isn't immediately obvious. So let me start sort of at the beginning. Rethinking sustainable cities, which is rather shorter than the Swedish equivalent. So the Swedish book is a summary, the title is longer. What do we learn from that? But there is a serious point. Why did we feel it was necessary to rethink the concept of sustainable cities? And then in the subtitle, why did we put the word and or och in the Swedish translation rather than or? Well, that's the easy one, because the three concepts which we use, if you like, as three of the essential pillars of sustainability are essential components of this very complex concept that has many components that is called sustainability. And the term has been around for probably 50 years or more in the specialist scientific literature, starting, interestingly enough, in the ecological and agronomic sciences, and then gradually finding its way into the social sciences and into the kind of lexicon of international agencies and movements, popularized on the one hand by the Ecologist magazine in the early 1970s, around the time of the Stockholm Environment Conference, and then most particularly the sense in which most people probably recognize it, was the Brundtland Commission in the 1980s and the landmark report that was published in 1987, Our Common Future. And that is all about the long-term view, the idea of not depleting our resource base and polluting the atmosphere, the rivers, the groundwater, the soil, that makes it more difficult for our children and grandchildren, other future generations, to enjoy, as it were, the value, or as many people now refer to it, the ecosystem services which these resources produce for us and need to continue to produce into the future. But why the rethinking? Well, very simply, as with all labels like sustainability, once they become popularized in everyday use, once they become an adjective in front of almost everything, whether it's a government policy or a corporate review, annual review, or a 5-year plan or a business cycle plan, on the one hand, that's a sign of success. Yes, we've achieved global prominence. On the other hand, and there is a sort of dialectical relationship here, it is also a problem. Because different people, different stakeholder groups, different vested interests attach different meanings to the word. And very often, it somehow gets devalued through that process. So that we have, on the one hand, radical ecologists and ecocentric groups who want us to abandon everything that in any way uses natural resources in a way that is not reversible under the label of sustainability. And on the other hand, we have large transnational companies that really want to put the word in front of what they do to give an implication that they are somehow environmentally conscious. But actually, when you analyze what's happening, they're still polluting the air, the rivers, the atmosphere, or whatever it is in their ongoing business as usual. And therefore, the word started to lose value, and people said, it's meaningless, it's too complicated, it means everything to everybody. And yet, as we know, we are now living in a world which is increasingly urban. And in fact, as you hear people say very, very regularly, for the last 7-8 years, Homo sapiens as a species has become predominantly an urban species. Now that has profound implications wherever on the planet we live, whether it is here in Göteborg, whether it is in a rural area in central Sweden, whether it is on the fringes of the Sahara Desert or the middle of the Amazonian rainforest, or indeed anywhere else. Because today, the entire world is interconnected in all sorts of ways. Some of these are very obvious to us, and because we live in an urban world, people who live in cities tend to like to visit other cities on their holidays, package tours to New York, or to Florida, or to Mallorca, or to Bangkok, or perhaps to rural areas which rapidly become urban as part of the tourist paraphernalia, the Phukets, or many other examples one could give. And so we travel and we learn a little bit about other places, and there are airline connections, there are telecommunications connections, there are financial flows, pretty well everything that we use that is manufactured, the telephones we use, probably the chairs we're sitting on, are manufactured tens of thousands of kilometers away, most of them these days in China, and are then shipped around the world to wherever they are used or consumed. And we generate waste products, nowhere more intensely than in urban areas. And while we might compost our garden waste or might have municipal scale composting, as Göteborg does very well, there are many other products which are not recycled or disposed of within the commune or even within the region. And there is a sort of counter-trade, for example, of waste products, computer waste, microchips from computers, electronic waste of all sorts, which nobody really wants in their own backyard. There are other forms of waste that have toxic minerals in them. Nobody wants them in their backyard. but they have to go into somebody's backyard, and actually it's very often somebody's front garden that they land up in places like Ghana or Nigeria or Bangladesh or China, where you have armies of people breaking these down by manual labor with negligible protective equipment and often at grave danger to their personal health and the safety of the local environment. So there is a very real sense in which our sustainability, if we're thinking purely about Göteborg or Stockholm or London or wherever, is actually at the cost of sustainability somewhere else. And we're all embedded in these complicated connections. Perhaps the most profound change in terms of urbanization and human development has been taking place in China and is increasingly so also in India. Now, one of the things that happens in China as incomes rise, as more and more people urbanize in these vast cities, is that consumption patterns, lifestyles shift towards the kinds of Western or so-called international standards and behaviors with Western-style housing and office blocks and Western-style consumption patterns. And one of the elements of that is an increase in pork consumption. There is very little grazing land in many parts of China, and yet they need to have more and more pigs to satisfy demand for pork. So what is it that Chinese increasingly feed their pigs on in order to produce the pork, in order to feed more and more higher income, urban dwelling people? And the answer is soya beans. Now, where is the world's largest producer of soya beans? Right on the other side of the world, in Brazil. And especially on land that is being cleared of tropical forests in the fringes of the Amazon, and not even just on the fringes anymore, further into the Amazon. And 20 years ago, there was a similar concern about the chopping down of the Amazon rainforest for cattle grazing to produce the beef burgers for Americans to eat in the US and Canada. Similar sort of phenomenon. So the whole world is embedded increasingly in these international flows of commodities, of finance, movements of people as migrants and refugees and so on. So almost anywhere on the planet now can no longer claim to be untouched by these radical transformations which are occurring. And therefore the notion of sustainability that we need in this kind of global context is rather different even from what was being talked about in the context of the Brundtland Commission and many of the other discourses 20 or 30 years ago. We need to get our heads around the fact that when we live in Göteborg and we want to live sustainably here, it is not just about what happens within the boundaries of the commune or within the boundaries of the region of Västra Götaland or indeed even Sweden, for the reasons in the examples that we give, that I have given, and of which there are many in the book in relation to accessibility, to greening cities, and to fairness or justice and equitability. But there are other things going on which change the ball game. And the most important of those is environmental, or if you prefer, climate change. And again, this takes place in different ways to differing extents in different parts of the world at any one time. And what separates and distinguishes this kind of climate change from any other kind of disaster of the earthquake or tsunami or volcano varieties is that they are becoming, according to all the scientific evidence that gets summarized every 6 or 7 years in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, increasingly severe and increasingly frequent. Now, we tend to hear and to see the evidence more conspicuously from distant parts of the world, the Caribbean, Central Africa, parts of Asia. But let me put it this way. You may have noticed that we had some rather intense weather in the last 36 hours here in Göteborg. Well, I don't think any buildings lost their roofs. I only saw one tree blown over this morning as I cycled into work. But it was still very windy, and it was pretty wet and intense, and there were hail storms in between and all sorts of changeability. Does anybody know what that weather system was that passed over here from Tuesday night to yesterday evening? That was the remains of Hurricane Maria. So it started in the Caribbean. It destroyed many of the islands. It took out a fair part of Florida. It spun up through the USA. Sadly, it missed Donald Trump, but then it came over the Atlantic and landed here. So there's a very specific, immediate example of how weather patterns, and it wasn't widely known in Europe that that was actually the Hurricane Maria weather pattern coming over. But the global weather systems are interconnected, and they're becoming more frequent. So the storms that we experience here are not just a particularly Swedish or Nordic phenomenon, they're linked to the global circulation patterns. And the more emissions we have from factories, vehicles, whatever, most of which are concentrated in urban areas, the more we contribute to these ongoing processes. And that's why the urgency for climate-smart action is increasing, and the warnings in every IPCC assessment report get stronger, and the boundaries of probability get shorter. In other words, the likelihood of change is becoming more likely, and the scale of the anticipated change that we can forecast on the basis of the best evidence is growing all the time. So that means in a coastal city like Göteborg, we need to be thinking about the implications of sea level rise. We need to be thinking about the changing climate. Just to give you one example that I'm very familiar with, by the middle of this century, the southeast of England, in other words, the area in and around London, is expected to have a climate that resembles the Mediterranean more than temperate zones. And that's only 33 years away. But even in the time that I lived in the UK, I have perceived those environmental changes. The rainfall pattern is totally different, and yet the infrastructure was designed for a different climatic regime where you had lots of that proverbial drizzle that kind of never stopped. You almost never see that these days. We have Mediterranean-style tropical downpours, a little bit like we've had here, increasingly frequently in the last few years. So the drainage on the roads, the capacity of the sewer system, the implication for the contamination of that from all the runoff, the ability to maintain fresh water supplies and sewage systems if there are floods of the sort that we see in Jakarta or in Cairo or in Rio de Janeiro or wherever with regularity. And we think, oh, terrible problem over there. But actually, they become our problem very rapidly. And the infrastructure here is not yet well geared to these changes. And that is one of the challenges for urban sustainability, and the importance of rethinking how we design cities, not just the new areas that are being built outside or brownfield sites that are being redeveloped within, but we actually have to retrofit our existing areas to cope with these changing conditions. Just as we're getting used to doing very efficiently, retrofitting individual buildings to reduce energy consumption and heat loss when we heat the homes or we cool them in summer. But the entire urban fabric ultimately needs to be rethought. And it's very difficult to do that building by building, street block by street block. But the challenge when we have a comprehensive urban area of concrete and steel and glass and bricks and tarmac and everything else is huge, and the cost is formidable. So we are well down the track, and Göteborg and many other Nordic cities are far ahead of many others. But in the 3 years that I've been here, I see evidence of just how profound the future challenge remains. And I think what is so difficult to understand is it isn't a distant future challenge. It's a very immediate challenge because the changes are here. The changes are now. They're not in 30 or 50 or 100 years' time as we used to have the luxury of thinking. And therefore, for all of us in our different ways, wherever we are, in the municipality, or in a research agency, or a university, or any other of the partners in the consortium, or no partners, a private company, a non-governmental organization, a community group, we all have to address this in terms not just of making sure that we put all our cans into the recycling and we compost our organic waste and we harvest some rainwater to water the garden during the increasing dry spells, although those are important as well. It's that bigger picture which it's impossible to address at the local level, you might think. But maybe it's only by starting with each and every one of us as individuals and households that when we aggregate up, we can effect profound change. And here's another very interesting and quite powerful example. Just last week it was announced that for the 3 months of July, August and September, more energy in the UK was generated by renewable sources, mainly solar panels, wind, turbines and a little bit of wave power, and nuclear energy, than all the fossil fuels put together. And for a country that has been as slow and reluctant to embrace sustainability and energy transition as the UK, that's pretty remarkable. And it's a result of several things coming together. First of all, the cost of the solar panels has fallen dramatically in the last 6 or 7 years, to the point that more individual households can afford it to put them up on their roofs at the domestic scale. So that's part of where individual households can play a role. Secondly, because the cost of solar panels and wind turbines has come down dramatically, more and more companies, including energy companies, are investing in larger scale facilities. But so are factories, so are local authorities, so are many other community groups, church groups, and putting panels on their roof as a way of replacing purchased energy with own generation and perhaps feeding into the grid. And that has changed the ball game, because the energy companies, which traditionally have relied on fossil fuel on the grounds that they were more reliable and much cheaper, have suddenly realized that they're out of date and that the future in terms of the pure economics has shifted dramatically. And one of the reasons for that is that China has become the world's largest producer of panels and wind turbines, but also actually the world's largest user. And until 3 or 4 years ago, China was argued to be the dirty young man of Asia, if you like, producing vast amounts of energy through inefficient coal burning and oil burning power stations, environmentally very damaging mega hydro like the Three Gorges Dam. But actually, it's as a result of the environmental consequences of those earlier decisions that they've realized the importance and the urgency of change. As you see with these pictures of people in Beijing and Shanghai, traffic police and so on, walking around with masks on their faces, unable to breathe the air. And so, because of the way the system works in China, they are very rapidly making a transition that is making the likes of the USA and Western Europe look positively slow and sickly in terms of the speed of adaptation. And although much of Chinese urbanization remains unsustainable, the new areas and the retrofitting of existing areas is occurring at a very, very rapid rate. And therefore, there are lessons in unexpected places. And that's true even of the research centers where Mistra Urban Futures works in the UK, in Kenya, South Africa, and we've just opened a new partnership in Asia. Working with our transdisciplinary co-production methodology, trying to understand through the comparative projects, which are now a key part of our second phase, how different sets of partners and their institutions in these very different settings address what are ultimately the same fundamental challenges of ensuring that the future, the urban future, is more sustainable than the current or the past urban existences. And the point about the book is to bring all these different strands together and to show how, in the world that is changing more rapidly probably than ever before, We need to be flexible in our planning approaches. We need to be adaptable. And we need to be able and ready, mentally, intellectually, as much as any other way, to move forwards fast. But because of that rate of change, it's difficult to plan ahead 10, 20, 30 years in the kind of linear way that many of the national and regional and local systems have traditionally done. So there too, we actually need to rethink very rapidly how we plan, the basis of planning, and crucially, we need to take our populations with us, whether we're in Göteborg or in Kisumu or Cape Town or Sheffield or Shimla in the foothills of the Himalayas, where the problems are very different in one sense, but quite similar in others. And therefore, the idea of learning from the experience of others using similar methodologies, which is fundamental to what we might call the Mistra Urban Futures way, is fundamentally about being locally embedded with particular projects and ideas coming up from the partners and the groups they represent within each city, but not being parochial in the sense of just thinking that what we do here and now is what it's all about, but learning about people in other localities with similar challenges, but different balances of forces where different factors are more or less important, and making sure that our city planners and our engineers and all the other categories of professional staff have the opportunity to work with their counterparts in these cities to understand at first hand the very different apparent challenges and ways of addressing similar problems of very rapid change, of unpredictability, of resource constraints, of trying to reconcile people's aspirations for a better quality of life, and somehow trying to do that without ever increasing the resource requirements of those improved living standards and qualities of life. So the sorts of things that happen here in terms of integrated public transport and district heating and growing more food locally to reduce food miles and the congestion of vast numbers of lorries bringing the stuff in, all of that is crucial. And these problems are being experienced elsewhere in very different circumstances. And the answers, the solutions that are being developed or to energy grids and so on are different. But in many cases, we could benefit here from those examples and the experiences and the lessons. So the challenge that we face, and this is crucial to what we're going to talk about right now in the next session, is how we go forward into our third phase and balance the importance of being locally grounded and founded, if you like, but not parochial in outlook, but being global in outlook and engaging with our partners in other cities and engaging with the international processes through the New Urban Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 with the UN and the European Union and all the other regional and global agencies, to which we have much to contribute from our work, but also from other initiatives within which we have much to learn. Because one thing that we can be sure of, the rate of change is not about to slow down. The predictability of the change is not about to increase. So our ability to survive and our ability to live sustainably in the future is going to depend on being adaptable, flexible, and crucially, the ability to take our communities and our populations along on that journey and not to have them or particular groups living in certain parts of our cities to feel isolated, alienated, left behind. So that's the challenge. And in the New Urban Agenda, one of the, as it were, key phrases and Agenda 2030 is leave no one behind. One of the reasons we have translated Rethinking Sustainable Cities into Swedish, and crucially into an abridged version, is to make it accessible to people who are not professional academics and don't like academic jargon or complicated ideas. So to make it simple and accessible, the illustrations, the pointers to the full version are there. And the next translation, as it happens, will be into Hindi for our new Indian partners and their constituencies, because there are far more Hindi speakers in the world than there are of many other languages apart from English and Mandarin, probably, and French. And no doubt other local versions will follow. And that also is crucial to the way in which we operate, of making our outputs and our products accessible to different communities, different user groups, in terms of appropriateness for the purpose. So we don't expect city planners and engineers to grapple with an academic book to solve a practical urban planning problem, but something like this, or policy briefs, will be helpful. Similarly, for community groups battling with problems of accessibility of the sort we were talking about earlier here in Göteborg, there are other outputs, there are blogs, there are more interactive forms of communication and videos and so on that we use to communicate the messages, to interact with people during the research. Because we don't just regard it as disseminating finished products, it's an ongoing process of interaction. And that is more and more what is needed in terms of this flexibility and adaptability for the future. So let me leave it there and hand back to Lars.
Thank you, David. I do recommend the book Rethinking Sustainable Cities, or the Swedish version. It's very interesting reading. Just a brief reflection. Leave no one behind. Let's take our populations with us on this journey. What would you say? Isn't that a bit too utopian? It sounds like a very utopian vision. Could it be too utopian?
In my experience, if you don't start with a utopian vision, you definitely don't succeed. So you have to aim high in order to ensure a reasonable level of achievement. If you only aim level, you achieve much less than that.
So you take a high aim.
But the serious point, though, is that even in cities that we think of as fairly egalitarian, of societies we think of as having low levels of inequality and enjoying essentially a middle class or upper middle class quality of life, there are always particular groups, sometimes visibly different, sometimes geographically segregated, and those things tend to go together, who do not enjoy that level of quality of life, of accessibility. They do not perceive the cities as fair in the way that the majority of the population do. And if we are to live sustainably and address the human rights and the justice of economy, of society and space, then we have to take them as a priority and those areas as priority. Because for sure we don't have the resources to do everything immediately or indeed all the time. But if we are going to address inappropriate infrastructure or outdated infrastructure and housing, if we are going to improve accessibility to services, to green space, to employment opportunities, and social networks and the density of those social networks, then we have to target certain areas and certain catalytic changes. And if we can identify the key constraints, the key problems, the worst off areas and start there, then there's a good chance of addressing some of the most severe problems and then in turn learning from those in terms of managing the less severe. But what happens all too often all around the world is that the people who are worst off, or the areas that are most in need of intervention, somehow get bypassed. The areas that seem easier to tackle, or the problems that look less insoluble, less intractable, actually get prioritized. And it's that prioritization that needs to be inverted. So we start with the most severe problems and constraints
Let me
first.
just finally ask you, you came up with fair, green, and accessible as terms, new terms, rethinking sustainability, because sustainability could be almost anything if you ask people. But don't you think there will be new conflicts between how fair and green and accessible should be used and understood, or maybe that's just the point, to have new conflicts around them?
That's the importance of the word and or och between them. It's all of those things. And there are often tensions. But the book is full of examples of where, if you target appropriately using the prioritization of the sort that I've referred to, you can actually achieve multiple objectives, or as they're often called in the literature, co-benefits. In other words, you don't need one intervention to promote fairness, another intervention to produce greenness, and so on. But if you target and you have joined up thinking, you get all the different sets of professional skills in a municipality together, for example, working as teams across the disciplinary or departmental boundaries, then you can actually address all of them with an integrated investment portfolio, and that's crucial.
That's crucial. Thank you very much, David Simon. And yeah.
Thank you.